Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. We're here again with another wonderful webinar from the Garrison community. This one hopefully is going to be a little bit different. This is more of a fireside chat rather than a direct slide presentation, death by PowerPoint, which we might be guilty of sometimes, so sorry. But I'm really delighted to be here today and joined by Michael D. Girolamo, who's an analyst at C4ADS. Michael, thanks so much for your time today. And I guess the first thing to do is really introduce what C4ADS does and some of the really interesting work that you've been working on that you're going to talk about today.
Happy to do so. Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael D. Girolamo, and as Aaron mentioned, I'm an analyst at C4ADS. C4ADS stands for the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, and we're an investigative nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that uses publicly available information to investigate what we refer to as illicit networks. And when I say illicit networks, what I'm referring to is the variety of malign systems and influences that exist in global systems, and basically cause global security issues, whether that's more traditional hard security issues or more novel understandings of security. So at C4ADS, we have 6 teams. Each works on a different issue set. Some work on more traditional hard security issues, such as state-sponsored threats or conflict-affected states, while others might work on more non-traditional security issues, such as wildlife crimes, natural resource extraction, or human security. I'm part of the human security team, which focuses really at the intersection of where human rights meet security issues. We look at a variety of very human-centered issues, such as forced labor, trafficking, and increasingly cybercrime and scam centers, which is what I'll be speaking about today.
Fantastic. Must be a really rewarding mission, I think, to get involved in and some of the impact and success that you can have in that sort of field. I mean, we interviewed a scam beta in one of our really early webinars. And obviously, some of the work they do is legally contentious, you would say. However, I think their heart is in the right place. And you can see the impact that, the people they go after, the impact it has. And you only have to watch a lot of videos on YouTube where you see people getting scammed out of their entire life savings, or effectively losing everything. And you can always see the lack of empathy or any understanding really on the behalf of the scammers. So I think it's a really important mission and something I think globally we probably don't do enough to combat. I think in the UK we have this issue where when it comes to things like fraud, there's a benchmark for investigations which is probably quite high for most people, but yet the impact of somebody losing, say, $100,000 is potentially everything they've ever had, and that can be devastating. But here it'd be it's not enough for us to care, which is a really heartless way of looking at it. And I think it's up to organizations like yourselves to really drive that mission and really push that forward. So thank you for what you're doing, firstly.
Thank you. No, it's a very serious issue, and it's still an issue that a lot of us are continuing to learn about. General knowledge of the subject it's really a murky subject. Having more and more people focusing on this issue set and better understanding the actors behind it is going to prove crucial to ultimately dealing with this issue and finding ways to really uplift those who are affected and hopefully make sure that these kinds of crimes don't occur to the scale they're occurring today in the future.
You sort of gave me a little insight into the kind of things you're talking about today. And I think what's really interesting, you touched on this overlap between cybercrime and scam call centers. So I guess it'd be really great to hear in your words, where those intersect, and I guess also the breadth and the scale of it for those people that are probably less familiar with cybercrime.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So I'll start with some context on scam centers in the context of Myanmar, and then I can delve a bit into why we chose to focus on this subject area. So scam centers if you've seen it in the news, you might have read that scam centers have become quite a prominent issue, especially in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia does continue to remain the epicenter of where scam centers are located. And what a scam center is it's really, as the name suggests, it's a compound where people are committing online scams. A common kind is one called pig butchering, which is a scam where basically you'll meet someone online and build up a persona where you're steadily building that trust. Oftentimes you'll be receiving, a steady stream of income, small amounts of money that steadily increases over time. And then eventually when you hit that critical amount, you shut off all context. You've slaughtered the pig, so to speak. But when I say scam center, I should also say it's so much more than just a place where people are committing scams. These compounds, especially in the Southeast Asia context, have really been at the center of modern forced labor.
So amazing, Michael. So I guess what would really be useful for the audience here, I think, is understanding really like what you mean when you say like a scam call center. And I guess also for those who are less technically minded, that intersect between like cybercrime, fraud, and how an organization like C4ADS comes together to look at that and investigate it.
Happy to do so. Thank you, Aaron. So I'll start by defining what a scam center is. I'll talk through the history of it very briefly, and then I'll get into what we've been doing on the issue and why we chose to delve into this. So when I say scam center, as the name suggests, it is a physical center. It's a compound where people are getting online and committing scams. So in its simplest form, what that means is you might receive a text message from an unknown number who's trying to get to know you. What could be happening in that case is there is a person at the other end of the line who's ultimately trying to commit a scam that will, bring in money from you to that scam center. A common kind of scam operation that has been featured quite prominently in the news is something referred to as pig butchering. And a pig butchering scam refers to where the scammer will contact the victim and build a relationship, steadily receiving money over time. And once they've hit a critical amount of that income stream, they'll kind of shut things down entirely. And that's where they've slaughtered the pig, so to speak. They've received that critical stream of funds and now they're shutting off all contact. So there's no way to get that money back. But what makes a scam center such a challenging issue set is while these scammers are committing crimes, oftentimes the scammers themselves are victims of crimes. And that's where the history and context of what a scam center is comes into play. So scam centers, cybercrime in general, committing scams online has existed since the dawn of the internet. But scam centers as they are today really arose since the COVID-19 pandemic. And this all stems back to China, actually, because in China, there's been a long-standing anti-corruption campaign under Xi Jinping's government seeking to root out corruption within China. And part of that had led to a lot of Chinese organized criminal groups establishing casinos and gambling operations in Southeast Asia, because as anti-corruption efforts really kicked in further and further in China, a lot of people who wanted to engage in gambling, go to casinos and the like, ultimately had to go to Southeast Asia to do so instead. So a lot of these groups who are oftentimes affiliated with Chinese organized crime would set up these casinos in places like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. But then while up to that point, they were able to get a steady income stream, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, interrupted that because international travel became so difficult. So a lot of these groups started to look towards alternative revenue streams, and that's where scam centers really come into play. So committing cybercrime, committing these scams is very lucrative, but in order to do so, you need people to do it. So scam centers have attracted victims from all over the world, including people from China, from Southeast Asia, even people from places as far away as Latin America, to come to these scam centers, and they force them to work. They'll trick them with false job advertisements and the like. And then when they arrive on the ground, they'll be trafficked into these scam centers where they're working in conditions which are practically akin to modern slavery. It's a case of forced labor. So the scammers are oftentimes victims themselves, which adds an interesting layer to this issue set. Because not only are we seeing the cybercrime element where people in the United States, in China, in Europe, and so on are being scammed of their life savings, but also the people scamming them are often not doing this of their own free will, and they're victims as well. So the scam centers are generally run by these organized criminal groups. And with that organized crime element as well, that adds another layer because they can use revenue from these scam centers to fuel other illicit operations, such as drug trafficking in Southeast Asia. In the case of Myanmar, we've seen evidence that these organized criminal groups have relationships with local armed groups along the Thai-Burmese border, which are ultimately affiliated with the Myanmar junta, providing a source of revenue in the ongoing Myanmar civil war. So there's all these different layers to the scam center issue where we're seeing so many different kinds of crime converging, making it not unique because not unique in the sense that these crimes are converging, because we do see this with other issue sets, but perhaps we can say it's unique in the scale of this convergence. You can say it's an organized crime issue, it's a trafficking and forced labor issue, it's a cybercrime issue. It's tied into the conflict we're seeing in the region. It's tied into drug trafficking. It's really bringing all these things together. And that actually brings us to why C4ADS decided to look at this. We've been working on Myanmar for several years at this point. We've been working on Myanmar related issues for over 4 years, with more ad hoc work having been conducted in the past, going back as far back as 2014. But our Myanmar work has focused very heavily on the enabler networks, which are fueling the Myanmar conflict, especially with regards to how the junta is able to fuel its oppression in the country. So because of that, we decided to look into scam centers because, as I mentioned, these organized criminal groups have relations with a lot of other players in Southeast Asia, including local armed groups. So in the Myanmar context, the country has been in a state of civil war for several years at this point. The Myanmar conflict is actually one of the world's oldest conflicts, going back to shortly after it received independence from the United Kingdom. But in its current state, this has been especially escalated since February 2021, when the Myanmar junta committed a coup d'etat, overthrew the democratically elected National League for Democracy government, and plunged the country into a renewed civil war. So in the context of the Myanmar civil war, the junta lost control of many of its border regions, but in some regions, it's allied with local ethnic armed groups in order to continue to exert influence. And these armed groups have relationships with the organized criminal groups running scam centers. And because we're interested in the enabler networks fueling the Myanmar conflict, we decided to look into these scam centers because with those relationships, there's been growing evidence that they've been engaging with players fueling the conflict, but we really wanted to better understand the degree to which they're engaging with each other in order to do so. I realized that was quite a long answer, so I'll stop there for now.
That's, I mean, really fascinating, I think. Just all those different pieces, like you said, that convergence might not be necessarily unique in terms of like what organized crime is, like how it works, right? But the scale, I think, is what you touched on as making it very, very unique. And I guess, do you think that the scale of it from this particular angle is probably due to how easy it is to do at scale from a laptop versus like something like implementing like drug trafficking routes and that whole chain end-to-end supply chain process would obviously be relatively complex to do without getting caught. Whereas cybercrime is actually not necessarily trivial, but it's quite easy and straightforward to be able to set yourself up to do these things without necessarily being easy to find online. And therefore you can do it at scale. I guess if you have access to people that you can take advantage of to do that on your behalf, and they can do 5, 6, 10 accounts, however many, like per day to target individuals, that scales very quickly. And obviously then I guess like the financial rewards that could come from that as well, from people who are, lonely or subverted into doing this, is quite obviously where the scale and the breadth and the success. And obviously it clearly works. So therefore the criminal groups are going to keep going after this and doing it at scale.
Indeed. Something I hadn't mentioned in terms of the scale is just how many people have been trafficked into these scam centers. Hundreds of thousands of people have been brought to Southeast Asia alone, and top destinations aren't limited to just Myanmar. We also see this in Cambodia and Laos. Scam centers exist in the Philippines, but really by highlighting like just how many people are involved. Like when you have hundreds of thousands of people being trafficked, like as you were saying, that really there's all these people working on this, that really augments your capability to commit these crimes at an industrial scale.
Yeah, that's I wouldn't have had any idea of that scale of numbers. I think just come back to what we just said as well, like, even if each person does 5 to 10 people as like their victims for, I don't know, say a week, like that is a lot of people over the course of a month, 3 months, 6 months, however long that process goes on for. In terms of the victims of the trafficking, do you see that they get like a way out at any point, or is this a case of a bit like a lot of like human trafficking things, modern slavery issues, where there's not really ever a way out because whatever reason for them to be trafficked, if they have a debt to pay off, quote unquote, like that, it still never gets repaid, and much like we see in Europe with human trafficking?
I'll start by saying our organization works much more at the high network level, so we don't engage directly with the victims of scam centers. There are other organizations which do phenomenal work doing so. So I'll start with that caveat. I am happy to share my understanding of it, but I just wanted to make sure that was appropriately caveated.
Of course.
With these victims, I do believe with the growing attention we've been seeing, that has put a lot of pressure on these scam centers to release people, especially in Myanmar. So in the Myanmar context, I mentioned earlier that scam centers especially exist in border regions. Currently, the area that's received the most media attention, and also the area we've focused on, is a place called Mayawadi, which is a township bordering Mesot, Thailand, and it's the main overland trade route connecting Myanmar to Thailand. So the Mayawadi area has gained a lot of attention because an armed group called the Karen National Army, formerly known as the Karen Border Guard Force, is this junta-aligned armed group which has provided security for and developed partnerships with the Chinese criminal groups which have come into the region and set up these scam centers. And that region received a lot of attention because not only was it like the epicenter for scam operations in Myanmar, while it's not the only place this is happening, it was the place with the highest concentration. It also was starting to traffic increasingly high-profile people. So earlier this year, there was significant controversy when a Chinese actor named Wang Xing was trafficked into a scam center compound. He had been invited to Thailand ostensibly for, if I remember correctly, just like a movie shooting. But then they tried to traffic him into Mayawadi, take him across the border into Myanmar. His girlfriend raised those concerns on the Chinese internet, and that led to a significant backlash in China, which put increasing pressure to take action. So with the Mayawadi context, what ended up happening was China put significant pressure on the Thai and Burmese governments to take action and crack down on these scam centers. So the Thai government, for example, cut power along its border that was allowing these scam centers to operate. And then a lot of these scam centers did release victims under this heavy pressure. Now that led to its own set of issues because a lot of them have ultimately been stuck in Myanmar, still unable to return home because this led to thousands of people suddenly, being stuck at the border, wanting to get into Thailand, with diverse governments around the world having to take various actions to get their citizens home. Some governments have been doing more than others. But I guess that's another long-winded answer. But what I was trying to really say is there has been international pressure, and in cases where that's happened, victims have been released. But of course, not every victim is that lucky.
No, of course.
Other victims have been released at a smaller scale through the payment of large sums of money to these scam centers. So with some, like Taichung Park, which is a notable scam center compound to the south of Mayawadi, which has primarily trafficked Chinese victims, if I remember correctly, families in China have been able to get their relatives released by paying basically exorbitant sums of money to local armed forces in the Karen National Army to ultimately get those victims out of the scam center. So there are ways out, but it often involves, frankly, like massive amounts of money, or in the rare cases where we've seen increased international pressure, like in Mayawadi, that have actually led to action. We've seen that as well.
Yeah, and I guess it's a little bit like ransomware, I think, like how you've described it there, where it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where, like, if you're paying them to get somebody out, well, that shows there's a market there that we can continue to exploit. Even if you do have a chain, you're still going to make money off the back of it as a criminal enterprise, which ultimately doesn't really help detract from making people stop doing it. And I guess it's that case of where the international pressure isn't where it should be. It's always a shame, isn't it? as soon as it's somebody high profile, in the example that you cited there, like suddenly there isn't enough backlash to do something about it. But I guess just as it would happen here, next week that's long forgotten about because something else happened or a politician said something funny, and life moves on. And at the end of the day, it's like you said, it's still, there's all the victims that don't have that opportunity or don't have the means to be able to use those same avenues to escape, which is really tragic.
No, I fully agree. I mean, this issue has been growing in scale steadily just over the past few years till it really reached this critical level where it started receiving that attention. But like you said, it took reaching that critical level and starting to impact high profile people to really get the attention that started to lead to larger scale action. And this has been going on for years. So some victims have been stuck in, frankly, this hell for years at this point.
Yeah, it's awful. I guess let's bring the conversation back around to like the open source intelligence side, which is why we're here. So you mentioned that you, as an organization, operate at more like that high network level. So I assume that's a lot of geolocation based research and investigations.
Yes.
Does that go down to like trying to map out networks of maybe not individuals, but groups that are probably doing some kind of business together and who may be involved in different parts of that? I'm going to say supply chain, but obviously supply chain is a terrible choice of words, but I think the point kind of fits where I guess you have the people doing effectively like the kidnapping, to the people doing the trafficking, to the people then using the people that have been trafficked to do their bidding as scammers effectively.
Yeah. So I don't think supply chain is a bad word to use. I'll say it wouldn't be the choice of words I would use in the scam center context, but because we work at the network level, supply chain comes in a lot throughout a lot of different projects, and it has shown up in our other Myanmar work. I mentioned we focus heavily on the enabler networks fueling the conflict. This could refer to the trade and financial linkages supporting the junta. So supply chain work does come in, especially when we're looking at industries such as aviation fuel shipments, aviation equipment, the mining industry, and so on. In the context of scam centers, we have used a lot more geolocation data. I'll also say, when we're looking at these network levels, we always use publicly available information, which we define as really anything you can find out there on the internet, in a book, or anything you can purchase from an aggregator. So on the supply chain side, that could be trade data aggregators, or in the case of our scam center work, we relied on mobile phone geolocation data. So yes, our work on scam centers has leveraged ad tech data, which refers to advertising technology data. And this kind of data is a form of mobile phone geolocation data that comes from a phone's advertising ID. All like online profiles we have, which are affiliated with our smartphones, are connected to something called an advertising ID. And this ID is used by the mobile applications on your phone to basically customize and target the ads you receive. And it collects information such as your geolocation data because the ads you receive will be based on where you are. If you've ever traveled to another country, for example, you might have noticed that like 2 or 3 days after you've landed in the country, your ads will start changing to the local country's language, or they'll start marketing that local country's products. That's because your advertiser ID has figured out that you're in a new location. Via that information, it's receiving like via the mobile applications, and it's targeting the advertisements you receive accordingly. So the information from an advertiser ID, which I should also say is separate from your phone number, they are not the same thing, is often sold by these applications on the open market. And then there's a variety of aggregators out there which will collect that data and structure it and clean it. The data as it is, because it's not affiliated with a phone number, is fully anonymized, which actually makes it much less valuable for identifying specific illicit actors than other data sources, such as something you might see in a corporate registry. But what it does allow these aggregators to do is demonstrate where a device was at a given time and place. So ad tech was really interesting for the scam center issue because with scam centers, we know at a high level what's happening. But when it comes to who the facilitators are and what like on the ground, our knowledge is still pretty sparse. This issue has only really received the level of attention we're seeing now in the past few months. This is a relatively recent phenomenon to see such a great interest in understanding these networks. There have always been people who are interested, of course, but because of that, there's a lot of challenges in understanding who the facilitators are and what they're doing, especially if we want to get to specific perpetrators. So this data is useful because if you can identify a given device, again, without knowing what its phone number is or who owns it, you can still see where that device was at a given time and place, and you could theoretically trace its movements over time. So what we did is we leveraged this ad tech data and looked at the entirety of 2024, and we identified 4 known scam center locations in Mayawati. And we wanted to see if these scam center actors were engaging at all with the Myanmar junta. Because there has been growing evidence that these engagements exist, and it's widely known that these groups engage with junta-affiliated armed groups, we theorized that you could use this data to add further evidence to that and see where these engagements are taking place and to what extent they're taking place. So after identifying these 4 known scam center locations, Shwekoko, which is a city to the north of Mayawati and the headquarters of the Karen National Army, KK Park, directly to the south of Mayawati, the Dongmei Zone, a little further south, and Taichung Park, even further south, we found devices that appeared in those locations over the course of 2024, and either were also detected in Naypyidaw, in a place called the Ministry Zone, where all the central government's buildings, ministerial buildings, are located, or they showed up in another scam center. So we were able to collect a list of these devices that met those criteria over the course of 2024. Again, visiting either at least 2 of those known scam centers, so they were traveling between each other, or a scam center plus Naypyidaw's Ministry Zone. And then we were able to use that to look for patterns in those movements and assess where those devices were showing up to see what insights that could reveal about the types of engagements that might be taking place. And what we saw was really interesting. Before I delve into that, I'll pause for a second in case you have any comments or would like to ask for anything to be clarified.
I think like this kind of data, so I've seen examples of this before, and like it blows my mind, right? Because like you said, everything's anonymized. Yet you can still infer really powerful things. And I think what the point you were talking around there, I think what was going in my head was, so you could probably infer over time if you might have like somebody who's a government official, predominantly, who is going to these sites, or you can then differentiate, this is somebody who works in the scam call centers, because we see them, they're always there, but then they come here every X period. I think stuff like that, being able to infer that and understand that those relationships exist, and I guess almost how heavily involved somebody could or could not be, even though you don't necessarily say this is that person, you can still infer that there is a level of relationship somewhere like in that chain, and how involved somebody could potentially be.
Exactly. And that's what made this such an interesting methodology. But of course, with this methodology, you do have to add appropriate caveats. As I mentioned, ad tech is a very scary sounding concept, and understandably so, because you can see location data, like you can see where a device was. But the fact is the data as it is anonymized, and you can't tie this explicitly back to an individual. So we have to add a lot of appropriate caveats, because actually compared to other kinds of publicly available information, generally what you're looking for if you're investigating an illicit actor is some kind of corroboration that you are looking at your target. And we can see that with like a corporate registry, for example. If you see someone's the director of a company engaged in bad activity, you have that explicit proof in a way you may not with ad tech. So while we can infer these things and we can make certain inferences based on the patterns we see, we just have to add that caveat. Ultimately, we can't put a name behind these devices.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But on the flip side, as you also mentioned, if we're seeing certain patterns, that does raise the likelihood that they play about what kind of role they have. And I think that's especially important to have as context when we're talking about scam centers, because if you're seeing movements between scam centers or to ministerial buildings, chances are the person who owns the device that's moving between these locations is likely not a trafficked victim, for example. They're likely not able to go visit a government ministry building or a minister's home in Naypyidaw. So it does increase the likelihood that the devices are owned by individuals who are of at least like a decent rank in their respective organization, whether that's the criminal group operating the scam center, the Karen National Army or another affiliated armed group, or the Myanmar junta itself.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So I think looking at the ad tech data and thinking about that in the context of an open source intelligence piece of investigation or research, I think what's really interesting is like you've touched on how that data is anonymized. So you can't necessarily infer who somebody is from the ad tech data by itself. But I think where the power of that data comes in is then when we employ those more traditional OSINT techniques. So we might be able to infer things like locations from things like potentially breach data. You might be able to tie it in from social media posts for people that you might be interested in. And then maybe you can start to see things like pattern of life from the ad tech data, which might also correlate things that you already know about subject of interest. And I think that's one of those things that we're only just starting to get on the cusp of as researchers and investigators, the power of that data. Part of that might be due, I think, like to the exorbitant cost. I think ad tech data at least seems to have, at least from my experience here in the UK, it's always been like whenever somebody mentions it, they always follow up with, but it's really expensive, which I think is always going to be like the initial starting block, especially for those in a more like amateur or very small, tight knit team where budgets are probably not that big. I think the research you're doing at work shows that you can leverage this data very well. So if you can access it and then you can bring that open source knowledge and investigative expertise, then there are really significant grounds and significant achievements you can achieve. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. I do broadly agree with everything you said. I'll say on my end, I'm not the best point of contact for discussing anything related to the accessibility price-wise. But going back to your point about how this can be an excellent tool, especially for understanding, in corroboration with other sources of data, such as social media, it can be an excellent source of information for further corroborating what we might already suspect is taking place. Though, again, with that caveat that we don't have the specific identifying information to confirm who an individual is. But I do see its strength in being that it can supplement other sources of analysis and build a better picture of what's happening at a broader level.
Yeah, so that'd be things where if you can identify like an event occurred at a location at a given time, you might then be able to pull information from the ad tech data, which can support which devices have been seen in that location, which you might then be able to cross-reference against other events that you know have previously occurred. And therefore, you might be able to inform at least have a better idea of what might have happened, who the parties may be involved, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. I believe that, and again, I think we're getting a little bit into theory here, but I believe an excellent example could be, let's say, that a meeting occurred between several illicit actors in a given place. You could theoretically use this kind of data to look at that location if you understand where the location was in a broad sense and determine if there was, for example, a cluster of pings on that exact time and day where it took place. And then you can see where those movements were going to and from that location over a broader period of time, whether that's just a few days before and after, or perhaps a whole month. And you can use that to further gather information that could corroborate whether or not these devices that are showing up are likely to be affiliated with those individuals who are traveling to that place. So let's say, and again, I'm just going to use a theoretical example. We know a meeting occurred I'm just going to choose a random location. Let's say we know a meeting occurred in Bangkok, and we know that the individuals involved came from, let's say, Hong Kong, from Malaysia, from Yangon in Myanmar. If we were to know that, and then we looked at that location, if we had that information, perhaps from a social media post or traditional news reporting, then we can look at that location in Bangkok on that time and day, see if there were a cluster of IDs identified at that location when the event occurred. And then perhaps we can look in the broader context and see if those devices had traveled to that location from, again, Hong Kong, from Kuala Lumpur, from Yangon. And that could add further evidence that could raise the likelihood that this was indeed taking place. Again, I know I keep saying caveat. That's my favorite word when I'm speaking about this data, but it can increase our understanding and contribute. It can act as a contributor, basically, to better understanding the context in which an event took place.
That's really interesting. I think like the point you just touched on there as well, like the security person in me has really gone like, scary. Because I think we touched around like, well, you can track an illicit actor. But I think if I take that cybersecurity position, I would also think, well, the illicit actors could also use this data. And whilst the obvious examples in my head are usually like it's going to be nation state led threat actors in cybersecurity, now that the like ransomware ecosystem, some of those groups have financial budgets which are probably on par, if not bigger, than some countries because of some of the successes that they've had. And I think if you're then targeting people that you think might be, again, this is, I guess, a very hypothetical situation. I've watched too many movies, but if you think somebody might be interested in investigating you as a criminal and you can leverage this kind of data and you think, well, if I think they work for, let's say, the National Crime Agency, I can locate National Crime Agency offices because that's public knowledge. But then where else do these people go, and can I infer anything else from those locations, and then start to build out those pictures? And I think that's that's where a lot of the fear comes from, I think, with this kind of data and this kind of research. But I think it's one of those double-edged swords where, well, we have to use this data to enable great work, like some of the stuff that you've been doing. But at the same time, there's always that trade-off that we know that the enemy also, it's a bad word as well, but the enemy might have access to that information. So it can be a double-edged sword, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I had a lot of those thoughts going into this. I think our entire team did, because again, like the concept of ad tech data is very scary when we think about it, especially because of the reasons you were just listing. But a bit at risk of repeating myself, and my apologies if I'm using a lot of the same vocabulary multiple times. But something that I was surprised to learn as I delved further into this data methodology is it reveals a lot less than a lot of other traditional OSINT methodologies. And I do think that changed my perspective of it. We've been talking a lot about how ad tech data is more traditionally a supplementary data rather than the primary source of information you might use for an investigation. And of course, in what we were doing, it was relatively novel in the sense that we used it as the primary methodology for the purposes of what we were looking at. But in many other contexts, because ad tech doesn't have that identifying information, it actually is less robust in certain ways than others. It's better for building a broader picture. So if you're looking at patterns of movement, like what we were discussing in the case of the scam centers in Naypyidaw, like it can be an excellent source of data for a kind of investigation such as that. But in other OSINT investigations, you're more likely looking into the specific illicit actor you're interested in. And this data just might not provide the same level of detail that a corporate registry, for example, would.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think just keeping that in the broader context is really important, because it's something we were thinking a lot about. And I guess like coming into it with the same kind of mentality where I was like, oh, this is such a spooky data source. And then realizing, okay, actually, there's a lot more on a publicly available corporate registry if you're looking at a specific individual, was kind of eye-opening in a way. Like it makes sense when you say it out loud and really compare things. But I do think like in our mindset, like in the popular consciousness, it does sound very different. And that's not to say it isn't scary. It's still a data source that's involving movement. And I think that's always scary when we're speaking about that. But yeah, I'll stop there. But I just wanted to kind of reiterate that because it doesn't have that specific like identifying information the same way other traditional OSINT sources do, that does kind of make it stand apart.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think you've articulated it really well. So, and that point around how more often than not, this would be supplementary data, which might, I guess in your example of the call centers, you might have already done a lot of research which indicates, right, we think the call center is in like this location, and that could be it. That could be anything from a country to a city to like part a certain subset of city. That data then, if you've got like that information, you can start to try and identify whatever locations you might already know, and then pinpoint, okay, this does look like an office block that is being used for that activity because these identifiers we know go to these locations, and we know that that's what that's used for. And that in and of itself is almost innocuous in terms of like a personal privacy risk with that information. And it's obviously, like you said, with that further research that you would do, and which could be on social media, it could be corporate registries, data breaches, could have so much more things which would be potentially impactful on an individual's privacy than anything you would have gleaned from that ad tech data beyond, okay, this location looks like it's a hotbed for what we're looking into. And I think that's a really interesting point.
I will say, while I'm speaking in broad terms when I'm talking about how it's traditionally a supplementary data source, I do believe it was a uniquely well-situated source for the purposes of what we were looking into. Because as I was speaking about earlier, with scam centers and the Myanmar conflict more broadly, this is a very data-sparse environment relative to other jurisdictions. And because of that, because it's so difficult to understand the actors behind and facilitating these scam operations, this data is uniquely situated, I believe, for understanding the relationship between the different actors. And of course, that might not apply in other investigations across other jurisdictions. But I would like to just say I believe this was very uniquely well situated for the purposes of this. I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but I think what makes it so uniquely powerful is even though it doesn't have that specific identifying information other sources do, it is uniquely well situated for identifying relationships. And in the context of scam centers, where so many are continuing to be set up within Myanmar and across Southeast Asia, increasingly the world, being able to identify patterns and movements that are clearly linked to these scam centers could theoretically point to new scam centers as they're being constructed. And I believe that's something that really sets this apart in this specific context. Because again, while it may not have that identifying information that we could corroborate through other sources, it could be an excellent starting point for understanding where illicit activity is beginning in this context. Traditionally with scam centers, we've taken a very reactive approach to the issue, really only paying attention to the extent we are now because of the scale of the crisis that's taking place. But theoretically, this could allow us to take a more proactive approach because it could allow us to identify movements from these scam centers to new locations and identify patterns there, which could point us to leads about where new centers are being set up as they're being set up.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned before as well about how that also helps you infer like the relationships between individuals and identifying like who the key players are versus people that potentially have been trafficked or being forced into modern slavery type situations. And I think like you're very right, and all of those things come together and help you really get that unique insight. And I guess in something which is an especially difficult target from a data point of view, that could be a real force multiplier in terms of focusing your investigative efforts and when you know where you need to be looking, and then you start to do all the really cool like geospatial type stuff and drawing lines on things and trying to figure out like, okay, this looks like the right location. And then I guess inferring things from things like social media posts and things like that, where you can bring back that more traditional elements of OSINT to come together and really provide like a really unique and powerful intelligence product, I think, at the end of that. So not to put you on the spot, I guess what would be really interesting to understand is how you think in fairly broad terms, how and where this like, sort of capability could evolve. And do you sort of see this becoming more and more ingrained into traditional OSINT workflows, maybe moving forward? Or do you think that at this moment in time, it's still fairly has that like almost niche value add, which in certain scenarios, which you've explained really well, like it can be super powerful. But do you think for most use cases, it's probably still going to be one of those things that's always going to be a nice to have, at least in the near term.
That's a fantastic question. I'm going to take a second to think about this to formulate my thoughts. Because I think, again, I'm going to sound a little repetitive, but I think it's contextual. I really love the words context and caveat, as you can probably tell. I would say it definitely depends on the type of investigation you're doing. I do believe it's a uniquely valuable data source, especially when you want to bring in that geolocational element into an investigation. But it really does depend based on the caveats we discussed earlier. I don't remember if we discussed this, but something that immediately came to my mind when you asked that is data quality across jurisdictions. I can't speak for the data environment as a whole. I can only speak for the data I've engaged with, but I do know some jurisdictions have much more data-rich ad tech data environments than others. And that's often based on the applications that are gathering this data and then providing it to those aggregators we discussed earlier. So, for example, Myanmar, Thailand are relatively data rich compared to some other jurisdictions. But if you're looking at a jurisdiction like on the other extreme, like North Korea, you're likely not going to gather much, if anything at all. So it is contextual based on the jurisdiction you're looking into. I would say, and this is my personal view on it, I can't say with authority on which jurisdictions are more rich than others, but I'd say generally jurisdictions which have app environments and phone environments that might be more similar to what we see in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom would likely have richer data environments, because by nature of many of these aggregators being based in Western countries, they're gathering data from applications that I imagine would be in the same jurisdictions. Conversely, with a jurisdiction like China, to use another example, the data would likely be much less rich because, again, the application environment is quite different. And if I remember correctly, but don't quote me on this, I do believe China has a quite strict data sharing law with regards to this. But
that makes a lot of
not
sense.
proficient in the legal environment in China. So that's just what I believe.
Yeah, I was actually, that was one of the questions I did have in my mind, was based on what you were saying around like Myanmar being quite difficult. North Korea came to my mind as an environment where it's notoriously difficult to find much information about North Korea that isn't directly from North Korea itself, and therefore likely, heavily censored or very curated as to what gets shared. And I think the point around China is also a really interesting one, given obviously China has its very rich technological ecosystem. But I guess to us from the outside, it's very much sort of very China focused. And therefore, getting access to that data from outside could be incredibly difficult as well. Maybe
Definitely.
not impossible. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think that's one of those things, because when you were talking earlier about difficult data environments, in my mind, I was considering, like, would this make sense in exactly those locations? Is this something that you could use if you have a reason for the investigation there? And I think you very nicely sort of summarize that. Probably not, because especially from a commercial point of view, from a commercial entity that's bought that data that is then providing it as a service, you're unlikely to be able to get that kind of information. And I think even like from a nation state level, it's probably quite difficult to do that in those environments, because for exactly the same reasons you've identified, like it's really hard to operate in those spaces. Which
definitely,
I guess, bringing that around to the topic at hand, do you think that then presents issues with potential sources of like human trafficking? Because I imagine a country like North Korea could be potentially a recruiting ground for that kind of activity. And therefore it becomes hard to, at least in that early stage of investigation and people moving from point A to point B, becomes much harder to investigate or to source that kind of information.
Yes, it definitely has those kinds of limits. I have a strong interest in North Korea personally, actually, because North Korea is so deeply involved in labor exports, primarily in Russia and China, but historically we've seen large quantities of labor exported to Southeast Asia. So I have had a personal interest on if there was any linkage there. But I can say, based on the data we were working with, looking at the scam centers in Naypyidaw, we know, to shift a little bit away from North Korea, but stay in that data environment, we know that Chinese organized crime is deeply implicated in scam center operations. So with that knowledge, it was quite interesting to see that with the data we had, we saw no movements to and from mainland China. And that does point to basically gaps in the data. Again, going back to that different data environment I was referring to. So that is a limit. In the context of scam centers, that would be a really interesting angle to explore, especially because with the nature of Chinese organized crime, we know it's implicated in these activities, but actually tracing these networks can be quite challenging. And unfortunately, as the data environment is, AdTech may not be the best suited for identifying those linkages if there is travel taking place between mainland China and these locations. Conversely, though, you could see movements to Hong Kong, as well as Taipei, which is quite interesting given these criminal networks operate across East and Southeast Asia. So you could theoretically use it for jurisdictions such as Taiwan and Hong Kong. But again, unfortunately, you're likely not going to capture everything, especially if what you're investigating has a linkage to these much sparser data environments.
Yeah. And I guess following on with that as well, with the organized crime angle that you just touched on as well, that's going to be a group that probably have, if not excellent, at least some basic understandings around what we'd call operational security and, not being easily tracked, or at least, that's what we're sort of led to believe, right? I know we've had examples where ransomware actors have done stupid things and been arrested and whatnot, but overall, those kind of organizations, they like not getting caught. So therefore, taking those extra steps as well, just to make your job that extra amount harder than it otherwise needs to be.
It's always a challenge. But I don't mean to just share the limit. I don't want to share just the limitations, because I know that sounds a little pessimistic. I would say it's just important to keep those in mind, that it is very contextual. Because again, on the other side of the spectrum, other data environments are extremely data rich. For example, environments that are comparatively open relative to other ones. This is going to sound like perhaps a surprising example, but Russia, for example, tends to be a much more open data environment than China would be. So relative to China, the Russian data environment could be expected to be much richer, including with this kind of data. But so it could, depending on the jurisdiction you're interested in and investigating, it could continue to be quite valuable. So I'd say for myself, when I'm thinking of how it can be used more broadly, to get back to your question that I diverged a little from as I spoke about China and North Korea, I would say that it is dependent on what you're investigating and where you're investigating. So in other jurisdictions where the data is richer and you are still looking at movements and you want that element where you want to corroborate movements and engagements, I still believe it's a very valuable data source and could definitely be either supplementary or primary for an investigation, depending on the nature of the investigation you're looking into.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it is really nicely considered as well. So let's try and move away a little bit from, I guess, the technology things. Probably talk about that all day. In terms of the reporting products that you've now created and what you've identified, I'm interested in C4ADS as an organization. So how does that reporting then hopefully turn into positive action in terms of, either rescuing people that have been placed into these horrible situations or bringing an end to the scam call centers, and whatever else they're being forced to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I guess I'll start by saying, as an organization, we do not operate on the ground in this region. So we're not the ones who are engaged with the rescue of these traffic victims. With that being said, we do have a robust partnership network, many of whom are doing truly phenomenal work, doing that work on the ground, helping the victims, and really doing just amazing things to help people who've been trafficked, as well as people who've been victimized by these scams in other places, whether that's in Europe, North America, or beyond. For us, though, as an organization, mapping networks is really our bread and butter. So the way we see ourselves in this broader picture is exposing the networks that are facilitating these operations. So that actually gets a little bit into how we're looking into expanding our work on scam centers. Because with our Myanmar work and some of our other jurisdictional work, depending on the team and the subject of what they're working on, we've focused very heavily on looking into the enabler networks, fueling conflict by supporting the junta directly in Myanmar. And because of that, that's often involved identifying companies and other illicit actors who are directly engaged in these operations, whether that be through enabling financial linkages or trade linkages that are directly supporting conflict. So getting back to scam centers, we do see that being broadly applied to there as well. When I'm saying networks facilitating these scam centers and their operations, what I mean is the different providers who might be providing them with the technological or financial means to sustain themselves and conduct these operations. It could mean identifying linkages where specific individuals, like let's say members of these scam centers that we've heard of some of them, like Sacha2, who are key facilitators, but of course there's others. Identifying those facilitators is another element. And then by using that information, while we might not be the people on the ground, exposing these networks and identifying those vulnerabilities could allow enforcement actors to take the steps necessary to cut off those linkages that are allowing them to benefit from illicit systems and ultimately sustain these operations.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess it's very much like it's an intelligence-led approach, and you're feeding into the organizations that will take that intelligence and then action in whatever way they see as best.
Mm-hmm. One more thing I'll say is the way we see it is by using publicly available information to reveal these networks. We're able to demonstrate that there will always be these illicit linkages that could be intentionally or unintentionally supporting illicit activity, like what we're seeing with scam center operations in Southeast Asia and beyond. So by providing this information with partners, whether they be enforcement actors or civil society groups, those groups which are working on the ground to help victims, this could just help illuminate the broader picture and allow us to understand what exactly is facilitating this so that we can adopt a more effective approach to combating this. Scam centers continue to be an issue that is relatively, I wouldn't say misunderstood, but our level of understanding about it as a whole is a lot less than other issue sets. So I do believe that expanding the picture and understanding what exactly is taking place will prove invaluable to developing an effective approach to combating them, especially as they continue to scale up their operations and commit these frankly atrocious human rights abuses against both the trafficked victims and the people who are being scammed worldwide.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think because you can go on YouTube and you can watch any number of like videos of scam baiters doing, good work in terms of trying to prevent the call centers from succeeding. Legal concerns aside, but I think that's a really important point you touched on, is where actually there are victims here in that ecosystem who don't necessarily have any other choice because the alternative is probably a lot worse. Mm-hmm. So the position they're in is very, very difficult, and therefore we have to understand that in the same way that there'll be other crimes committed elsewhere in the world where maybe an abused spouse murders an abusive husband, something like that, and people have sympathy for that. Like, oh, what you did was not necessarily good, but you felt like you had no other choice. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we lose that empathy in this space because we see scam bad, fraud bad, person lose money very bad. Like that's a terrible story. But behind that, and almost behind that headline, is, you're completely right, this whole network of things which lead up to that event happening. Mm-hmm. And it's not just a case of everyone doing this is out for their own financial greed. They literally have been forced into this, probably under threat of death, to either do it or not. And I think that's a really important point.
And because of that, it requires a uniquely unified approach that brings together organizations from civil society, from the private sector, and governments alike to take action. Because with these scam centers, it's unique in the scale of what's happening, but also in the sense that the victims at these scam centers are victims themselves of forced labor and trafficking, but they're also committing these crimes. And it's a uniquely terrible situation because there's just so much criminal activity at all levels. And because of that, these different actors across those three groups I mentioned have unique places where they can help combat this issue, but they can only do it in conjunction. For example, many of the civil society groups are at the forefront of helping the trafficked victims, as well as the victims of the scams themselves. They play a very important role because they're helping the people whose lives have been deeply impacted and sometimes nearly destroyed by these operations and compounds. On the other hand, the private sector, they have a unique role as well, developing greater enforcement on their platforms, ensuring that it's more difficult to commit scams against people, protecting their consumers in jurisdictions worldwide. And then governments, they play a unique role as well. They're often at the forefront of enforcement action, shutting down these operations and protecting their citizens. And if each of these sectors operates in isolation, that's only tackling one part of the broader picture. And that's why illuminating what's happening and identifying these networks is so important, because all these three areas have to engage together to ultimately combat what's happening. And we can't do that if we don't understand the broader picture.
No, for sure. So with that in mind, what you just said, which I think is a really poignant point, where can we, I guess, as the people that might be probably interested in this kind of research and this kind of work, is C4ADS's reporting products and stuff, are they publicly available? Maybe probably sanitized to some degree, but is that something that we can read online? Do you do video webinars, briefing through investigations? Is there a stream of online content which we can consume?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I wish the communications team was with me because they can answer this more eloquently than I can. But long story short, yes. We have been increasingly actually ramping up our public events. So we do have online webinars. That's something very exciting that we've been upscaling. We actually have an events coordinator, a newly created position, who's really been working hard on upscaling these efforts. So where there's interest, we're always interested in talking more about the kind of work we do and how we can engage with others to illuminate these networks, whether it's in Myanmar, Southeast Asia more broadly, or all over the world. As for the other side of your question, we do offer briefings to our partners and audiences that may be interested in these issues about these investigations, where we can talk in more depth about what we've investigated, what this might mean, what next steps could be. And of course, we also do publish on our website. So the work we've been discussing about scam centers today is in a piece called Hotlines. And you can find that directly on the C4ADS website, where we delve into this data source and basically everything we've been discussing today about what it means, the patterns we saw. And we also do that for all of our other programs and lines of effort. So you can see work on issue sets as diverse as the conflict in Sudan and what's fueling that, the Belt and Road Initiative, organized crime and corruption in different regions of the world. I'm just speaking about issue sets that have certain parallels to what we've worked on relating to Myanmar, but there's so much more than that.
So my question to Michael was around how and where people can engage with the work that you're doing as an organization. So effectively I was asking, can we read about the investigations? Do you run webinars? Do you have community events, things like that? And you very graciously said, we do, but I'm not the right person. So here you are.
Yeah. So that is a good question. We do have a variety of things. I mean, first to the question about can people read what we put out? Yes, we frequently put out lots of public reports, public commentaries, blog posts, things like that. All of those can be read on our website. There is a section of the website that includes all of those things. You can search them as well. And then usually when a new one goes out, we post about it on LinkedIn. We'll send out an email blast. We post about it on our other social media too. To keep track of those publications, definitely the best thing to do is to follow the social media, keep track of the website. And then also, as far as events are concerned and publications, we do have an email list, which I would say is probably the best way to keep track of what we're doing, because there's different subject areas that you can register interest in if you sign up for our email list. And when you do that, then we can reference those. And if we have, for example, in a couple of weeks, we have a webinar coming up on IUU fishing. And if you had signed up for the mailing list and registered interest in, for example, South America or fishing as issue areas, then we would invite to that event and people can know that it's going on. So I would say following the social media is good for that, and then signing up for the mailing list, which you can do on our website. As far as events and how we engage the public generally, we do a lot of different types of events. We do webinars that are generally completely public, and so when those are happening, we'll post about them. We also do some more private or semi-private events for partners as well, which is not necessarily something that the general public can attend, but is something for partner organizations to know about. So we frequently put on smaller events and happy hours for partners in specific areas that we work in and things like that. So yes, we do a lot of public engagement. We're increasing a lot of it recently, and would love to share, especially the public stuff, with anybody who's interested in attending, really.
No, amazing. Thank you so much. I realize we put you on the spot. So great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. And if I could just add one more thing on that front. You had also referenced if people wanted to engage with us more directly in your question, I believe. We're always happy to answer questions regarding the work we do. You're always able to email us. We have contact information on the website, and then you'll be put in touch with the relevant point of contact who worked on that project. And we're always happy to engage further from there.
Fantastic. And that's C4ADS.org, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you both. And Diana, thank you for just appearing.
Of course, happy to appear.
Michael, it's been a really fascinating conversation. I think there's a lot to really read into and a lot of stuff that I think we can all take away and have a think about. The piece around technology is, cutting edge in terms of like open source research, but at the same time, the use case to which you're applying it, I think, has so many very intricate parts and very nuanced investigative angles to look at, from the impact it has on people, to from the victims to the people that are trafficked, to the organized crime element and those geographic data contentious issues as well. There's so much there to look at. So I think anyone who has watched this up to this point really should probably take the time to go and read about the investigation as well, and see some of how that research comes together in a fully fledged product. I think that would be a fantastic way to spend some time. So again, thank you for joining us. It's been a really fascinating conversation, but it's been a really lovely time talking to you. And I think C4ADS are doing some fantastic work. And on behalf of the UK OSINT community, I think this is going to be a wonderful, partnership between organizations. And I can't wait to see where we can collaborate and emphasize some of the work you're doing, and hopefully get some more people to attend some of our events in the future, and hopefully maybe give a talk, something like that, maybe later in the year. That would be absolutely amazing.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you so much for the kind words. Likewise, this has been a really fantastic conversation. You've asked some really great questions, and I've really enjoyed chatting about this in more detail. And likewise, I'm very excited to see where this relationship goes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.